One thing my shop has been sorely lacking is storage, and the storage I do have is a hodgepodge of junk I've accumulated over the years. On this episode of The Average Craftsman, I'm going to quench that thirst for storage by building this fancy schmancy shop storage cabinet. Like every cabinet project, I start by breaking down the plywood with my track saw. I usually only break down what I need to get the project going, and for the storage cabinet, that meant the sides and the stretchers. Once I have the pieces down to a more manageable size, I head over to the table saw and cut out the pieces to their final width. Often on my channel, I have talked about how much I like using Pure Bond plywood from Home Depot. Well, this was the first really bad piece I've gotten. One layer was almost completely delaminated, but luckily it was only for a few inches, so the whole sheet wasn't wasted. I've recommended this plywood a lot, and I hope that this is a one-time deal, but I'll be sure to let you all know should I run into this issue again. Once I had all of the parts cut out, I labeled them all with a sharpie on painter's tape. This really helps keep everything organized. The ends and dividers needed to have the toe kit cut out, so I marked them on the pieces and headed over to the bandsaw. And I am clearly doing a great job keeping this piece flat on the table. I took the stretchers over to the miter saw and squared up one end and then flipped them over and cut them all to length. The stop block enabled me to ensure that they were all the exact same length, which is obviously important, which is why building this miter saw station has been so helpful. This is the kind of stuff I used to always get just a little bit off in the past, and it was extremely frustrating. All of the cabinet carcass parts were now cut to size, so it was time to drill a bunch of pocket holes and then move on to assembly. It seems like every time I use pocket holes, I try to come up with some new way to keep the parts aligned because whatever I used before didn't work. This time I'm using a hand screw clamp to keep the sides positioned on end, and then use the Kreg pocket hole clamp to keep the stretchers positioned correctly on the sides. I probably worry way too much about this stuff because these joints will never be seen, but with things like this, I'm incredibly anal, so I guess that's my lot in life. Speaking of anal, I decided these shop cabinets needed edge banding. The lengths I go to impress the boss, eh? I mainly did this because I'd never used edge banding before, and I thought this would be a good opportunity to practice. There's really nothing to it. Just cut them to size, iron them on, trim the ends, and then flush up the edges. There are numerous ways to trim the edges. You can use a router, a chisel, or a razor blade, but I decided to buy this little edge banding trimmer from FastCap. It worked pretty well, but I think there's room for improvement. Well, it turns out I bought the low-end version. FastCap also offers a pro version, which includes carbide blades. It's $40-ish compared to $20-ish for the one that I bought. If I could take care of this trimming in one swipe, I think it'd be worth it. There's a link in the description of this video if you want to learn more about these trimmers or any of the other tools I used on this project. And now back to the assembly. I used 1.25" screws to secure the stretchers anywhere two of them are at a right angle. I could have just as easily used pocket hole screws here as well, but I'm pretty sure I hadn't thought of this beforehand, so this was my solution. I headed back to the bandsaw to cut out the toe kicks and notches for the stretchers on the two inner dividers. The space for the vertical pullouts was going to be a little tight, so I decided to attach the drawer slides before installing the two inner dividers. I marked their locations and then used my Kreg drawer slide jig to get them positioned correctly, and then used a few screws to attach them to the dividers. Some spacers helped to accurately position the dividers in the cabinet, and clamps held everything in place while I used 1¼ screws to attach the dividers. I could now move on to attaching the rest of the drawer slides to the cabinet. My garage floor isn't remotely flat, so I knew I needed to come up with some way to level it out. I used these leveling feet on my assembly table and I really liked them, so they were enlisted for this project as well. 2 levelers were used on each of the sides and the dividers. The great thing about these levelers is that they are easily adjustable from above using a screwdriver or socket, and they are only about $15 for a set of 4. Time to move on to the drawers, which means back to the track saw to break down the plywood. You can see here that I'm doing 2 passes to make these cuts. The first pass is a scoring cut where the blade cuts only about 1/8 of an inch. The scoring cut prevents chip out on the offcut side of the piece. This is one of the features that this DeWalt track saw is lacking, and I didn't realize it when I made the purchase. Festool's track saws have a little piece that comes down on the offcut side of the blade and prevents chip out. It's not a big deal, but if you're breaking down a lot of plywood, it can definitely add time. While not a deal breaker, it's something you should be aware of if you're in the market for a track saw. And I also believe that Craig's version also has the anti-chip out feature on their track saw. Back at the table saw, I ripped all of the parts to width and then used my crosscut sled to first square up one side and then flip them around and cut them to final width. You may be wondering what the 2 pieces of ply are for that are up against the stop. Since 3/4 inch plywood is usually not actually 3/4 of an inch, it can be a little tricky figuring out exactly what length to cut the drawer fronts and backs to fit in the opening. To make it easy, just measure the opening, subtract 1 inch to account for the drawer slides, set your stop to that number, and then put these 2 pieces of scrap in there to represent the drawer sides. I got this tip from Brad Rodriguez of Fix This Build That. He has a great video on making simple drawers that I will link up in the top right. Once more, we return to the Craig jig to drill about 150 pocket holes for the drawers and pullouts. I have a lot of cabinet projects coming up, and this one is probably going to convince me to spend the money on the Craig Foreman, so don't be surprised if you see that pop up in a video in the near future. The pullouts were first in line for assembly. These pullouts have a front, side, and bottom, and then a false front will be attached later. The front attaches to the sides, which will ensure that we are able to hide the pocket holes in the finished pullout. Next, I moved on to the drawer assembly, which again involved me coming up with some makeshift jig to keep them square and all the pieces properly aligned. This one works pretty well, but it just takes a long time with the various positioning and clamping that needs to be done on each drawer. Enter the brad nailer. Rather than clamping, I just decided to brad all the parts together and then go back and secure everything with pocket screws. This approach might be the winner for me. It was pretty quick and easy. To finish up the drawer boxes, I attached 1/2 inch bottoms using screws. Using screws was not the best use of time in hindsight. Anymore, I'm just going to use glue and brad nails. I initially used screws on the off chance I would need to replace the bottoms, but I just can't imagine a scenario where that would be needed too often. Most people use 1/4 inch bottoms for their drawers, but there's something about 1/4 inch plywood that just feels and sounds cheap and underbuilt to me, so I always use 1/2 inch. It's just one of my various idiosyncrasies of which regular viewers of this channel are probably well aware by now. To attach the pullouts and drawers to the slides, I used a 1/4 inch spacer to position them from the bottom. Pulled the slide out a little to drive in the front screw, pulled them out a little more to drive in the second screw, and then remove the slide from the cabinet to drive in the back screw. I'm sure you've seen this done hundreds of times in various videos. Nothing new here and not complicated at all. After installing the bottom drawer, I used a larger spacer to install the next, and it was just rinse and repeat for the remaining drawers. At this point, I entered the "Hey dummy, it's just shop furniture" part of the project. I needed to make the drawer fronts, and I decided it would be a good idea to border them all with walnut. All of the plywood parts were cut out on the table saw. The walnut parts started as a long piece of 8/4 that needed to be resawn to get two boards 3/4 of an inch thick. My little Wen bandsaw was not up to this task. It took me 16 minutes to resaw this board. The saw would stall if I didn't go painfully slow, but I was able to pull it off. However, it was at this moment that I decided to upgrade the bandsaw, so you might be seeing that in the next video. After resawing, I could joint and plane everything down to 3/4 of an inch thick and then cut it down to size at the table saw. The approach I took to bordering these drawer fronts was to cut all the plywood a little oversized lengthwise, and then I could glue on the parallel borders. Once the glue cured, I took them to my crosscut sled and cut them to their final length. The border pieces were left a little thick so I could flush up both sides. Using a router on thin stock like this can be a little dicey, so I decided to use a hand plane. It was a lot of work, but they turned out okay. A couple of days after doing all of that work, I saw a clip on Instagram from Guy Dunlap doing this on a router table. His approach would have saved me so much time. That post is linked down in the description if you're thinking about making drawer fronts like this. To speed things up a bit, I just used some bandy clamps and brad nails to attach the other two border pieces on each drawer front. These pieces were also left a bit long, so I needed to trim the ends. Using a piece of scrap as a standoff allowed me to cut these ends perfectly on the table saw. The scrap piece is only needed when cutting the first side. The piece could now be flipped and run through the table saw normally to cut the other side. And then more planing to flush up these ends. Now that the drawer fronts were complete, I could attach them to the drawers. This was very easy since I used pulls that are attached with screws that run through the entire drawer front. I clamped a piece of plywood to the bottom of the cabinet to support and align the bottom drawers and pullouts. I then used spacers to stack the remaining fronts to ensure everything was aligned and correct. Unfortunately, I misplaced the footage of drilling the holes for the pulls, but that was done using the Craig drawer pull jig. Using those holes, I could temporarily attach the fronts to the drawers, which allowed me to pull out the drawer, drill holes from the inside, and drive in screws to permanently attach the fronts. After removing the temporary screws, I drilled out the holes for the drawer pull hardware and attached the pulls, gave the drawer a little test, and then mounted the remaining drawer fronts and pulls. I've said drawer so many times it's starting to sound weird, like saying the word comfortable over and over. Anyway. Back at the table saw, I cut out all of the pieces for the top assembly, which included one layer, the full size of the top, and several stretchers to make the top 2 layers thick. I attached the stretchers to the underside of the top layer so they would sit on top of the sides and dividers when they were attached to the cabinet. The stretchers were positioned so they were a little proud of the top, so I could go back and flush everything up with a trim router. The front trim was then glued and clamped to the front of the top. While the glue was curing on the front trim piece, I sanded down some walnut and mixed that dust with some glue to make a filler, which I applied over the brad nail holes on all of the drawer front border pieces. The drawer fronts were then sanded to 220. For everything else, I sanded to 220 off camera before assembly. Once the front trim had cured, I glued on the side trim pieces and then cut the front trim piece flush with the sides. Some hand planing work was needed to flush up the side trim pieces with the top. My trim router was then used to add a chamfer to the front and sides of the top. Everything got another quick sanding to 220 to prep for finish. I initially decided to brush on some water-based polyurethane, but that got old real quick. So, headed out to Harbor Freight and picked up one of their $15 HVLP guns, which made quick work of spraying down the cabinet, top, and drawer fronts. A piece of walnut was used to cover the toe kick. The drawer hardware was reattached. And the top was attached to the cabinet using 1 1/4" screws. I was now able to put the cabinet in its place, install the drawers, and fill it up. This project is the start of a few organization projects I have in the works, so for now I'm just filling it up without much thought, and then when all of my cabinets are completed I will organize each drawer. Though I did take some time to experiment with kaizen foam in one of the drawers to hold all of my video equipment. More on that in another video. That's it for this project. If you're interested in building your own shop storage cabinet, I do have plans available on my website. You can find a link in the description. For those that have watched the whole video, you are being rewarded with 50% off of this plan using the code TIPPYTOE. If this is your first time here and would like to support the channel, please like the video, hit that subscribe button, and click the little bell icon. Thanks for watching.